Hello everyone, and welcome to the Fermi Paradox. I'm Disturbing Puppet, and today we're checking this out. This is an early access and available on Steam. This is something that I checked out when I think Splattercat did a video on it with the demo, and it's now in early access. You can play through a bit more. So this is essentially a kind of god game of the entire universe, where the whole point is to try to foster various different alien races to evolve, spread out into the universe and make contact with each other and advance technologically. You can sort of make choices as things progress of their progression and what they do and how they progress at different points when they advance to different ages. You kind of push their culture one way or the other, and when certain crazy events happen, you can sort of affect the events. So it's really a text-based thing. It's sort of more about decision making. I'll kind of show a little bit of the way the game works. It's pretty self-explanatory, and then I'm going to kind of go over the game that I've been playing, which I'm about close to 5 hours into and pretty close to the end. Really, what happens over time is that you build up these stories about each civilization and what happens and what they've done. And I kind of just want to go over each of the various different civilizations that are around and explain and talk about kind of their history and what's happened and kind of give you an idea of the stories that build up over time as you go through this. As always, when this loads in, when I come back from a save, it does this thing where it sort of says like creating stars and galaxies and all that kind of stuff. And I'm hoping, yeah, that's not going to be an issue. So far, it always is loaded fine. It just sort of is weird when we do this. So it always kind of freaks me out and is like, you're loading a saved game. You don't need to restart the entire galaxy over again. Although this is taking much longer than usual for it to actually make any progress, which has me a little bit concerned. Hopefully everything will be fine. I also can't move the mouse around, which has me also concerned about the game freezing. I'm going to give it a minute, and then I might have to see what's going on here. I don't get the impression it's crashed or anything. It's sort of hung up and doing something. Doesn't say it's not responding, so I'm hoping it's fine, and we'll figure out how to get through this. Oh, now we've got the not responding. Gonna wait for a minute here and see what's going on. Hey, there we go. It just took it a while. Like a really long while to get through that. Okay, so it's going to do this, which always kind of freaks me out. Hopefully it'll load back in correctly, everything will be fine. But you kind of get these points where you can kind of babysit specific, I'm kind of calling it babysitting, specific species at different points in their development when things are going really bad, and sort of try to guide them through where they need to go. And if something major happens to another species, you can always come in and sort of deal with that. Okay, so this is the universe. So what we do essentially, so the game is paused it'll go a little bit of time and then it'll just kind of automatically pause. So every single one of these is a star system. So this is where humanity's at in the Sol system. There's a bunch of information about it. There's these things that will pop up on every single one, and each of them are going to be different, and they're always random. You can only pick one per essentially kind of phase. So these are the most simple ones. This gives you synthesis. These points are used to kind of do positive things for the various different species or save them from really bad things happening. Over here we've got various different things. So this level of technology, the number of people and their growth, how much resources they have, when they're going to run out of resources, and this has become a major issue since we've kind of gotten a lot of people into the singularity age. Resources are still kind of running out, and earlier on you can run out of resources as well. Potential war casualties, so depending on how warlike you are, in this case, quite low, and how far you are in the tip towards utopia or dystopia. So every single one of these things will have either a plus, like this has a plus on it, or a minus. So this affects, you can kind of see the icon here, deposits. If I click on this, it's going to increase resource scarcity. It's basically going to decrease resource scarcity. It's going to increase the amount of time you have until you run out of resources. If it was this with a plus, it means you're going to increase the population or increase your growth rate. If it's negative, you're going to decrease your growth rate. And this is a good way to kind of control resources. So the more population, the more resources you burn through. Also here, if it's a plus, it's moving towards utopia. If it's a minus, it moves towards dystopia. If it's an atom symbol, which I'm surprised they don't have here, if it had a plus, it moves your technology forward. If it's a minus, it moves your technology back. The one that's a bit confusing is when it comes to the war one. If there's a plus, it's actually good and is decreasing the amount of people who will die in a war. If it's a negative, it's increasing the amount of people who will die in a war. Okay, so that's the basic thing. So if you don't have any major events going on, this is what you essentially do: is you sit on a species on one of their colonies or their home world and sort of make these choices about how to kind of guide their development. So at this point, let's go ahead and start with humanity. So in the universe, there's this big long list of things that has happened. Unfortunately, it won't go down too much further. So Earth is in the Singularity Age, 45% Utopia. It is the home of the Remnant Fragments. So there's a reason they're called the Remnant Fragments. So essentially, Earth, humanity was the second race that evolved in the universe. And I was kind of working with the other one. I didn't really deal with humanity too much early on, and they actually advanced really quickly technologically. They got ahead of the older race, so humanity was actually doing really well. Humanity did very well for a very long time. So essentially, as things progressed, when we got to the nuclear age, which is about 1950s to 2000s level technology, humanity built an ark with the most, like the best and brightest, put them in it, and sent it off to a neighboring system called Kepler, and we'll go there next. And it took them a very long time because it was very low tech, and it was sort of a multi-generational ship. It took them, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably at least a couple hundred years to get there. And that's something I wish it would actually show me, like galactic year, so everything would give me a better idea of kind of the years going by. By looking at stuff, it seems like every time you click on something and it goes, it's about a 10-year roughly kind of period. So humanity on Earth did a really good job, was progressing on really well, developed AI, moved into the singularity level of technology. So you can kind of see various different things. So they built virtual experiences, rivaled reality, able to clone, all this kind of stuff. So as resources kind of dwindling, and this resources become a major issue as we've progressed, we've managed to prevent too much harm to the environment. So then we have here at the bottom, it's kind of showing why it's the remnants. In one of the darkest corners of the Sol system lives a bizarrely mutated flesh abomination, a former remnant transformed by banned regenerative BioWare technology into a nearly immortal being that was hunted by fragment agencies. So what essentially happened at one point, we kind of have up here, a new form of hyper-intelligent, self-destructive, it was sort of a nanobot AI, killed most of the remnants it was intended to serve. In the AI's autonomous learning processes, its mortal creators were deemed annoyingly inefficient. Their extermination was halted only by a safety failure in the core source code. So humanity lost somewhere on the region of 90% of its population to this. So these self-replicating AI nanobots just spread and wiped out 90% of humanity. And I don't think it was during the Singularity tech level. It might have been during the previous one, which is Lightspeed. So 90% of humanity died on Earth. So that's why it's sort of remnant fragments. Since then, population massively increased. Growth was really high. I've actually been trying to reduce the growth to kind of keep resource scarcity at bay here. But we're still all the way back up to 75.6 billion humans. It was down to right around 1 billion left after that happened. I think it was about 10 billion and like 1 billion left after the nanobots ate everybody. So humanity is progressing along, and my goal here really is to get them to the final technological state so I can end the game. So that's pretty much the story of humanity in the Sol system. Out here at Kepler, and I'll give you this, these are sort of signals that have gone out from various different places and spread and contacted other places. All right, so out to Kepler. So this is the home of the settler clouds. And you can, if you wanted to, every single turn, you could go to every single different settlement and decide which is the most important, but I usually just kind of sit on one and go through, so that's sort of a thing. So this is where the people who left Earth in the nuclear age, so kind of early 2000s level technology, late 1950s, early 2000s technology, came here, landed, and still had nuclear level technology, and they were already at like Lightspeed tech back on Earth by the time they got here, because it took so long to get here. Very few people, they settled fairly well. Things went mostly good. There were a number of resource scarcity issues, which led to some wars. So you can kind of see fighting over matter deposits, and there was some other fighting, I think, about helium at one point. There were some helium wars going on. So they've sort of developed a little bit of a different culture over time. These are, I think, the most utopian of all my different people, so at 84%. So they've done a pretty good job maintaining their civilization and plugging along. Growth is really high. They're actually up to 93 billion in the system, but scarcity is going to be an issue pretty soon. So also war quite low, super utopian. So this has been a pretty nice planet, a very good success story. They came here very early on. There have been some scarcity issues and some wars over resources early on in their tech, but not too bad. But they progressed all the way from kind of 1950s tech when they got here, probably more like 2000s tech, all the way through. It has like Cyber Age, and then Solar Age, which is sort of you're actually able to gather all the resources of your star system, to light speed, and then from light speed you go to singularity. So that's kind of where we're at. They've progressed all the way back. The weird thing, though, is that Kepler and Earth have never actually recontacted each other in any way, shape, or form. They've never sent planets or ships back and forth. They've never sent a signal back and forth, any of that kind of thing. All right, so the other people that left Earth left during the Singularity Age, and they settled over here in the Gehenna system. So these are the settler expert clouds. So they have a science-led government from cradle to grave. That's kind of a recent thing. No aspect of life on Gehenna 6 went untested by the rigors of the scientific method. Its experts grew in power and prestige to become leaders among the settlers. That's pretty recent, because actually when they first got here, they suddenly became very militaristic. So they built a bunch of... So they sort of showing like fought over valuable matter resources and deposits. That kind of happened later. Before that, they had built heavily reinforced military bunkers and that kind of thing. Then they kind of got into a series of wars because of resources, things kind of falling apart. And then they went all the way from having a singularity level technology all the way down to, I think it was solar. So kind of all the way down to just kind of barely being able to survive in the system. And a lot of the people died off. And then they've worked their way all the way back to singularity from then. So you kind of see these things as kind of things go along. So when they first got here, see, they underestimated the hazards of the Gehenna system. So ancestors of all animals here were deep-sea creatures. Most life forms have twisted proportions and grotesque appearances. All these kind of cool little things that kind of pop up. And only some of it is saved here, and I wish you could kind of go through more. Maybe I'll read through all of them when we get... I think it's in order from here on up, because this is the most recent. But there were a number of wars here. I think there was helium wars here as well. So research colony that settles was heavily reinforced by AI commandos and military space fortresses shortly after it was established. The spirit of those colonial defenders became part of settler culture, but then later they turned into this very scientific-based society and utopian 50%. Same thing here, where they actually haven't recontacted Earth in any way, shape, or form, but they have received signals from another race, and I think we'll talk about them next. So that's the Odo. So the Odo down here, this band is very early in their technology, kind of 1950s era when they invented rock and roll. They, as a society, decided, hey, we're going to send out a signal everywhere, and we're going to boost it and put a lot of societal resources into doing that, and people are still making contact with them. So these guys are sort of intelligent ape-like creatures. And these guys developed third of the various different alien species. So around the time humanity was, I think, kind of around nuclear era, these guys first evolved. So in Tau Ceti, you can see there's 17 billion of them. Growth is very high. Scarcity is not going to happen for quite a long time. So they developed Lightspeed Age. Oh, it went away. All right, let's go down. Let's look. So... yeah, so we've got kind of a thing down here. So cybernetic devices, this is way earlier in technology, so it should go way further, but it doesn't. This world is kind of interesting in that the Odo developed here very early in their development. I think like Iron Age or Bronze Age, the planet was in an eclipse for an entire year, and it got very, very cold, and the entire population dropped down to just a few 100,000 on the entire planet. So almost all of them got wiped out very early in their civilization, and I had to spend some time trying to keep them alive and focusing on trying to get them to recover from that massive catastrophe. And they've done pretty well since then. There are quite utopian. They're at Lightspeed age tech, so they still haven't even made it to Singularity, but they have done pretty well for what's happened with them. So cybernetic devices planted in the brains of the Odo were once able to receive the marked jazz music of the humans, but a firmware update removed this function. So humanity sent out jazz signals into this general direction, and it was actually picked up by the Odo, and it became kind of a cultural phenomenon for a while. So the Odo developed Lightspeed age technology for military applications with extra relish. They devised even more terrifying tools of destruction, from autonomous battle bots and intimidating mech suits to optimized plasma beams and magnetic projectiles. Which is interesting because they haven't really fought much. So the most disciplined soldiers of the Odo trained to fight in phalanx formation. That was quite a bit earlier, Iron Age. The Odo suffered a long period of conflict between government forces and narcotics-dealing cartels. This was kind of during Nuclear Age, I think. The inevitable outcome of a militaristic approach. The cartels responded in kind, initiating an endless arms race. Organized crime syndicates, harsh regulations, and militarized police units became common. So the Desert Drifter Evacuation Force visited Tau Ceti. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There was a couple times they visited, actually. So we've got two. We'll talk about that when I get to the Desert Drifter Evacuation Fleet, which is a pretty interesting story. So taking a path of wisdom through the ethical jungle of the Cyber Age allowed Odo to consider potential dangers carefully and keep an eye on safety, embracing artificial intelligence with a leap of faith, which they were right not to take blindly. So they haven't really totally embraced AI compared to one of the other species. So they've done quite well. Early on, I thought they were going to die off, but they actually managed to survive. They are slowly advancing through the tech tree. There's quite a few of them. I've been trying to reduce their growth a little bit, but they're doing pretty well as far as resources. Okay, so the least interesting is the last. These guys did detect signals from the Odo. So these are the Kar. The Kar are evolved from a predatory, very aggressive early species. And initially, they survived by just killing off other creatures on their homeworld and kind of ran out of resources. They've run out of resources multiple times. They've had multiple resource wars, but they still keep coming back. And I thought for sure these guys were going to go extinct way long ago, but they're actually doing really well now. They've got resources for a while. Their growth is pretty capped. There aren't a ton of them, but they're doing quite well. They are way dystopian, especially compared to everyone else. Everyone else is pretty utopian. These guys are it's a very horrible world for them. But there's kind of some reasons. They dropped way down in tech level because they ran out of resources and fought multiple wars, and then have kind of clawed their way back. So huge hypersaline lakes divide the land regions, and between their salt crystal shores, vast forests of transparent flower trees are flourishing. Some Kar thought it was important to be preserved chaste within the company of others, though privately they were sexually active as ever. This is kind of an event that happens earlier on, kind of related to religion. The Kar communities went down a dark path during the asteroid ore crisis in their solar age. Many Kar lost access to essential resources and perished from scarcity. So that was a big period where a lot of them died off. There were big wars going on over resources. Since the radio test signal from the Odo civilization reached Glass C, entire media outlets exist who create xenophobic reports and calls for defending Kar society from invaders. So they responded very negatively to receiving signals from the Odo. Major Kar communities were left to stabilize after insurgent conflicts led to innumerable census casualties and prolonged civil unrest. Drawn into ruins by the rule of Energy Rifle, the Kar civilization, against all odds, survived a complete exhaustion of resources. But the society that was created from the ashes of the former communities was immensely cruel and unjust. So they totally ran out of planetary resources, totally collapsed, went way back down technologically, and then have kind of clawed their way back up to solar technology. I think they were actually not at solar when it happened. Taking a path of wisdom through the ethical jungle of the Cybele Age allowed Kar to consider potential dangers carefully, so we kind of saw the same thing. So they haven't really embraced AI as well. So the Kar are sort of my pariah race. I kind of picked them. It was like if something cost nothing or gave me points, I went with it with them. So some negative events that happen will give you extra synthesis points that you can use to kind of save others. So I've kind of used these guys because I thought initially they were just going to get wiped out. And I mean, they're flying snake things and they're horrifying. So when something bad has been happening, I've kind of been keeping them alive, but I haven't really been focusing too much on making their lives wonderful, helping them out that much, but it's helped get me synthesis points to save others. Okay, so one of the more interesting races was the first race that developed. So up here in the Digital Siblings Network, the Esh evolved. So this was a polar world with a large ocean underneath it originally. The Esh are basically like furry eels, which is kind of creepy, but they were the first race that developed in the universe, and I babysat them for quite a while before humanity ever even showed up. But they ended up being behind humanity technologically eventually. So around the time that the Esh were in sort of their Bronze Age, their planet changed from being a polar world with an ocean underneath the ice to being a desert planet, and a huge chunk of the Esh died off. So they eventually developed into these weird caravans. So they would travel around in caravans going from kind of resource pool to resource pool and water pool to water pool, and eventually built this kind of nomadic civilization from there and went from there. So that's kind of why at one point they were called kind of desert drifters, or sort of an offshoot from them. So they're currently called the Digital Siblings Network because much later in their development, when they developed AI, they gave AI full citizenship rights and incorporated them completely into their society as equal citizens. The main problem here now is technology has allowed me to push out the resource scarcity for a while. I've been trying to reduce their growth, but it's just massive, and you can see there's 120 billion of them in this system. So just a bit of their kind of history. It only goes back a little bit, but in the face of budding asteroid tax evasion, the sibling network applied sweeping financial legislation that nullified the incentives to travel the asteroid belt. So at one point, all the rich people were trying to flee to the asteroid belt to avoid taxes. That was just sort of an event that came up. So they once built a prototype of a completely autonomous interplanetary warship. It came up with strategies so untypical and frightening for the digital siblings, they never built another one. There are still rumors that the ship is somewhere lost in deep space following its outlandish tactics. There was an option to build a ton of these at the time, and I ended up just building the one, and it kind of wandered off. It's interesting because this is a society in which AIs are equal citizens, but this particular AI ship was viewed as being just way too dangerous. So the digital siblings mastered the art of extracting DNA of scientists and created clones with exceptional research capabilities. However, the requisite levels of privilege and higher education needed for their genius to flourish proved costlier and harder to clone than the superior brains themselves. So yeah, if you're an intelligent, like amazing scientist, they're just going to clone a ton of you and make you do research. Some digital siblings left the Rigel system in interstellar vessels constructed by sentient code constructs in the hope of expanding their civilization towards Wormwood, and we'll get there. The Desert Drifter evacuation fleet, we'll talk about in a bit. Software became self-aware, and Rigel and code-based beings were eventually granted all the same rights as the digital siblings, partly because nobody dared to stand in their way when they asked for equal status. A supreme network dominated by the digital siblings, its controllers commanded the majority of the AI commandos and military space fortresses of the civilization. So, fairly early on, the digital siblings, before they were actually the digital siblings, they were like the desert nomads or something, sent a colony off. I think they were at the point of like Lightspeed Tech, somewhere around there. Lightspeed or Cyber sent a fleet down over here. Actually, we're up here. Sent a fleet to Sirius. So the Esh once inhabited this system. So this system, you can kind of look and see kind of information about it. So Civilization at S destroyed their environment by colonial exploitation and exhausted all their resources. These inhabitants of the Sirius system were able to build a massive evacuation fleet that headed towards the Tau Ceti system. So there were 30 billion Esh in Sirius when they completely ran out of resources. And instead of trying to find a technological solution there, they basically, I kind of used synthesis to help them with this. They packed up the entire population, all 30 billion of them, into these massive, like arc ships, and decided to head off down over here to where the Odo are. They're basically looking for another place to colonize. So they went down and found the Odo. It took them a little while. I think they had Lightspeed Tech, so it wasn't a huge amount of time. Maybe 50 years, 100 years, something like that. Got down to the Odo. They observed the Odo for a while, and then eventually decided to make contact with them. And the reason the Odo have such advanced technology is because the Esh from this world, when they got down there after observing them, shared a bunch of technology with them. And that's why, even though the Odo are still expanding, they've got a ton of resources for plenty of time, and it actually bumped up their technology level as well. So after that, they decided to leave, which I thought was kind of weird. So the Esh went and decided to travel back to their original homeworld. So they went back to their original homeworld, where the Digital Siblings Network are, found them there. They even actually looked different after a while, after evolving on Sirius separately for, I don't know, a couple thousand years. When they went back, they sort of observed the Esh. This particular group that lived here never really incorporated all of the AI advances. So this is actually them. They're still in their evacuation fleet. After leaving Odo, they had a major accident with their fleet on the way, and they went from 30 billion down to about 1 billion. And they actually went lower, and I've only kind of recently kind of gotten their growth to be positive. So they went down to about 1 billion and then dropped even all the way down to about 600 million, and then they're now kind of creeping back up. So they had this huge, massive fleet. Kind of reminded me sort of the Eldar. So these world arc ships traveling through space, going down, visiting the Odo, sharing their technology. Then they leave, then have this massive accident after they leave. A huge, massive number of them get killed off, and so there's a few of them left. So what have they done since then? Well, they shared the technology with the Odo, had the accident, went to their homeworld, observed them for a while, left. Went back to the Odo, observed the Odo for a while, didn't make contact the second time, and now they're heading back to their homeworld again for the second time. So their original homeworld, not the one that they've settled, but their original homeworld. They're also quite utopian, which is kind of weird. So we can kind of look at their information. There's not a whole lot of stuff here. So the Tau Ceti system was once, let's start down here. During the journey, the Drifter crew missed the marked jazz music of mankind civilization. The computers failed to discern the signal from usual radio wave patterns. So they picked up the signals but didn't actually figure out what it was. Scientists developed many treatments to improve the health of their crew. Mortality rates aboard the barge fell drastically. Tau Ceti system was observed by the evacuation fleet. So this isn't really giving you a whole lot. There's a whole lot that was going on in that system before they became the fleet. And you can kind of see some of that with the different places if you look at like contact. But they're in the ships here, and they actually will travel across the map with time. So they kind of go back and forth. They're just, for some reason, going back and forth between these two worlds and decided those are the only places they're going. So their particular story, I think, is really interesting. So they settled here, lived here for a very long time, became the Desert Drifter. Yeah, Desert Drifter. Then it became the Desert Drifter evacuation fleet, and still have remained that. Technology, it seems like when you're at that point, you're not really advancing that quickly. So the Esh have also, fairly recently, they sent, we kind of saw some information about them sending, during the Singularity era, a group of colonists out here to Wormwood. So this is the digital sibling colonists. So same digital siblings, but they're colonists. So you can see there aren't very many here, 75 million. And growth is quite low. So about 1 billion people were in the fleet that went out here to Wormwood. This was another polar planet. They landed at the poles and were not very well adapted to it. It doesn't really say, but I don't think there was like an ocean underneath or anything. They ran out of resources because they had to kind of crash land their ship. So there wasn't a whole lot of resources left. And then they, in one final effort, built this transmitter to send the message about what happened back to their homeworld. And since then, instead of everybody dying off, the sort of concept and idea of maintaining the signal and continuing to have it send as long as possible has sort of built a small little bit of a colony that's been able to survive. Whereas most of the people have died off, or that most of the Esh have died off, a small group have remained and are able to actually survive, but their main focus of their kind of planet now and their society is maintaining that signal to send. So we can look a little bit here. So the green rivers and lakes of Wormwood Prime are home to millions of different species of snails and insects. The microorganisms feed on the freshly cooled magma and cover the landscape with tiny holes. The abandoned remains of the expansion fleet from Rigel are lodged in the Arctic regions of Wormwood Prime. Traces of the digital siblings who founded this colony can still be found throughout the icy wastes. One ordinary day, sibling colonial laboratories picked up weak traces of the radio test signal from the Tau Ceti system, so the start of a new scientific area with the goal of finding out more about the Odo. So they've found the Odo signal as well. When colonial consumption led the sibling research colony to use all of its resources, a desperate group of social engineers and colonial scientists managed to get hold of the last functional colonial laboratories. They sent out a cry for help to the entire galaxy. Although around their signal hub, a small community of digital siblings survived the collapse. So the only ones left are just around that one little settlement, keeping it going. And you can see 75 million. They still are in singularity technology, but population's way, way down. So these are the kind of stories that get built up as you're kind of playing through. No life ever developed in the Vex system or in the Trappist system. I don't know if there's a limit for how many develop, but it's been a very long time at this point. But yeah, so at this point, I'm kind of trying to advance the technology level and or have aliens make physical contact with each other, I think. Even though we did have sort of a contact and exchange down here with the Esh and the Odo, the Esh that came down in their big fleet just eventually took off and left. They didn't actually stay and settle. They even came back again and observed later and then just left. And part of that is at certain points, if you don't have enough synthesis, you can't kind of force certain actions that are beneficial. So you kind of need to have a pretty good store. I'd say try to aiming for about 20 to 30 at all times is a good idea. But also keeping an eye on things like resources, population growth, those kind of things are very important. But that's just kind of the story so far in just this one game. And that's about 4.5 hours, 4 hours, 45 minutes, something like that, of playing in this. So all of that has happened in that time. And it's a really interesting game in that you kind of, as you're going moment by moment, it's not a whole lot of stuff going on. And especially early on, things are going kind of slowly. But over time, things go really drastically wrong, and then kind of people clawing themselves back from the brink of extinction. In some cases, doing that multiple times. Internal war, constant war, conflict, that kind of thing. Like the Car here have actually fought a lot. The settlers here also did quite a bit of fighting over resources earlier on. But yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I really hope that there's a lot more events and species added and stuff. Even on Earth, when I had the option to start there, I could have paid some synthesis to evolve like a dolphin race instead of humanity, which that was kind of funny. But I'd like to have like more alien races available, more events, more different events for different places. I do like kind of showing the signals and how slow they are, giving an idea of kind of how fast light speed. So really, like the Odo sent this message out when they were in like 1950s era rock and roll, and they're now a pretty advanced light speed era race that have advanced pretty massively, especially considering how badly they were earlier on. But yeah, this is a bit of Fermi Paradox. I'm really enjoying it. It's a really chill game to kind of play. You're just kind of going through, making quick decisions. You can kind of, like even here, I can just grab some synthesis or make decisions about things from different places. It's really interesting. And like I said, you could jump around and really micromanage and look at every option every single turn. But I kind of feel like that's sort of a waste. What I've done more on is focus on if a really catastrophic event happens someplace, an extinction level event, that kind of thing, or race is trying to claw its way back from near extinction. I'm sort of working with them mostly. If something major comes up or another species reaches a new technological level, it'll actually give you sort of a heads up, and you'll have to go deal with that and say what you want to do with it. So when species do reach a new technological level, you have a little bit of input on what they're going to do as part of that. So there's always that kind of pushing you forward as well. So even if you don't micromanage a race, they're still going to advance and things are still going to happen to them. It just might not necessarily be there to sort of control things like resources, population, as well as you might otherwise. But yeah, this has been kind of a quick look at Fermi Paradox and the history of the universe, at least my universe. I'm assuming it's always going to be these planets and this kind of setup. And then you're just going to have different species evolve and spread different ways. Yeah, it's a really interesting game. I like it a lot. I just hope that there'll be a lot more variety of events and ways to interact with those events. And I have noticed as well that depending on what choices you've made with a civilization, when you get to certain events, certain things might cost a different amount of synthesis. So, for example, there was a point when the Odo reached kind of their point where they were trying to decide if they wanted to send signals out into the universe. Earlier on, I had spent some time focusing on the Odo and had made them a very sort of utopian, but also very focused on kind of philosophy, what's right and wrong, laws and rules, which is kind of funny because later they turned it like these giant criminal cartels evolved much later. Um, but because of those early decisions, when they were thinking about sending a signal out into space, it was actually free. It didn't cost me any synthesis at all for them to send a boosted signal everywhere in the universe. But when that option came up with humanity, when they were thinking about sending out kind of their jazz signals, which is actually this bar right here, um, it would have cost me a bunch of synthesis to send it everywhere and boost the signal. So instead, I just went for, yeah, some people decided to send a signal out one random direction, and that's this signal right here that got sent out, which has made it to the Odo, and so they've picked up the jazz signals. So, but that cost me, I think, 10 or 20 synthesis, something like that, if I was going to send a signal out everywhere. Might have even been more. So it sort of depends a little bit on the civilization about what the costs are going to be, which I think is really interesting. I also do like the fact that if you do decrease your population, you are also going to increase the length of time your resources are available. So there's definitely a very direct connection between your population and how long your resources are going to last. And resources seemed pretty good early on until things kind of collapsed in Sirius, and then things sort of collapsed other places like the car. They were actually in a lot of trouble early on because they were feeding off of beasts, and instead of it saying things like asteroid fields for resources, it was actually like beast herds, and so they were like hunting them to extinction, and it was causing a major problem. But yeah, this has been kind of a look at Fermi Paradox and what you can expect as you play through the game. I'm really enjoying it. It's really cool. I like the stories that build up over time. It does take a while to kind of get there, but it's really cool. I'm hoping they expand on this a lot more. So yeah, this has been Fermi Paradox. I've been Disturbing Puppet. Hopefully I'll see you all again another time. Until then, have a good one.